Winston, with a PhD in history from St. Louis University. Bryan Winston is the postdoctoral fellow for the Dartmouth Digital History Initiative and lecturer in the Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Studies program at Dartmouth College, with financial support from, among many other places, the Kansas Historical Society just down the road from us. Professor Winston is writing a transnational account of ethnic Mexican life in Missouri, Kansas, and Nebraska during the first half of the 20th century. He is also creating a digital history project titled Mapping the Mexican Midwest that visualizes Mexican migration routes, institutions, and social networks in the region. As postdoctoral fellow and project manager for the Dartmouth Digital History Initiative, Winston works with a team of historians, librarians, and developers to create open source tools that make oral histories more searchable and more accessible. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bryan Winston.
Thanks, Dave. All right, let me share my screen. Okay, so thank you to the Institute of Digital Research and the Humanities for the invitation today. Specifically, thank you to Sylvia Fernandez for the initial invite, and then to Dave, Bryan, and Kaylin for shepherding this event the rest of the way. Though I am joining you virtually from Hanover, New Hampshire, I am excited to technically be back in the Midwest and in a state I have come to know very well through my research. Today, I'm going to discuss the utility of digital mapping in challenging our conceptions of space. Specifically, I will share more about my research on my research on Mexican migration in the Midwest and my digital history project, Mapping the Mexican Midwest. Crucial to my research and mapping project is understanding how Mexican migrants use mobility to foster urban-rural connections and develop transnational ties as characteristics of their regional community in the lower Midwest. I will discuss the establishment of Mexican churches in the region, migrants' relationship to Mexico, and Mexican consular organizations. At times, I will go under the hood of my digital project to suggest methods and tools for visualization that can tell stories, as well as address some of the challenges I face and often appear in digital mapping. Scottsbluff, Nebraska is nearly 600 miles from Kansas City, Missouri, and over 1,500 miles from Mexico City. In late 1931, representatives of the Mexican state in both cities focused their attention on the small rural town of western Nebraska. Mexican migrants hoped to craft a patriotic Mexican community in the area by writing their consulate in the office of the Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores, or Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for pictures of then President Pascual Ortiz Rubio. Their letters also requested books and articles so they could determine how to best serve Mexico from afar. But this was not the first communications from Scottsbluff. Prior to 1931, migrants in western Nebraska had already worked with a previous consul to create a Comisión Honorifica Mexicana, a patriotic organization sanctioned by the Mexican state in Scottsbluff, Nebraska. The letters and the active Comisión pressured then Kansas City consul Carlos Gagiola to undertake the long car trip to western Nebraska in May of 1931. When there, Gagiola not only concerned himself with the economic and social well-being of his Mexican compatriots, but also how they could be in spiritual contact with the homeland. Gagiola met with the president and treasurer of the Scottsbluff Comisión Honorifica, two officers who organized celebrations of Mexican Independence Day later that year. Gagiola's visit collapsed the distance between eastern Kansas and western Nebraska and the distance from both to Mexico City. When Gagiola returned to Kansas City, he again wrote officials in the Mexican capital to ask the status of the books and pamphlets the Scottsbluff Commission requested earlier that year. By the first week of June, the Minister of Foreign Affairs wrote that he had confirmed with the Ministry of Public Education that patriotic paraphernalia was in transit to Scottsbluff. These letters and visits, as well as labor and leisure networks, structured a regional community in the lower Midwest, a community built and maintained by the Mexican migrants who resided in metropolitan areas, smaller cities, and rural towns and farms in Missouri, Kansas, and Nebraska. When thinking of Mexican migration and community formation in the first half of the 20th century, Nebraska, Kansas, and Missouri did not quickly come to mind as sites of vibrant communities and essential places for understanding the Mexican migrant experience in the United States. In fact, the Midwest is often conceptualized as a white and rural space. If Latinx people are represented in the region, usually it is in a post-1965 world and in urban centers. But this was not the case. The history I will share with you today is part of a larger scholarly effort to recover the Mexican past in the lower Midwest and confront racialized conceptions of the region by illuminating Mexican migrant placemaking. I approach this recovery and reconceptualization by pairing my scholarly work with a public-facing digital history project, mapping the Mexican Midwest. The site provides context for visitors to get a better sense of the people and institutions that made up these communities. It also helps guide them through the exhibit before they reach the interactive map. There are explanations of the different things being mapped, such as the many Mexican communities in the region and the different things and the difference between urban and rural areas. Churches and the different denominations, and consular organizations like the Comisiones Honoríficas Mexicanas. The site also provides details on how to navigate the map by choosing what you want to visualize and explaining what the different markers mean. In doing so, it provides narratives and visualizations that, one, emphasize urban-rural connections by showing the proximity of these communities to each other, as well as using unique markers that present the communities as nodes for connections. It, two, makes an obscured or hidden past legible and prominent. And three, disrupts a modern map with a 100-year-old community, a juxtaposition in itself that challenges us to rethink this space. So, let's dig deeper into this history, the sources that allow us to better understand the region's Mexican past, and the possibilities for visualizing it. While I do not visualize all the sources I will share with you today, you'll notice that many of these sources contain data that can be mapped, not only to represent the Mexican migrant experience, but to challenge spatial conceptions, and in my case, what we think we know about the Midwest. Mexican migrants to the Midwest often came from central Mexico, and most commonly the states of Jalisco, Guanajuato, and Michoacan. This heat map of the origins of migrants registering with the St. Louis Consulate is just one example of central Mexico being a major sending region to the Midwest. While focusing on Mexico, we see a visual representation of the makeup of Mexican St. Louis circa 1918. In just this simple representation, one can already ask new questions of the supposed gateway to the West that shifts our focus to movement that brings us southwest to north, rather than the common story of an east to west migration. After leaving central Mexico, migrants then traveled to the US-Mexico border. Those who came to the Midwest usually traveled to Juarez and then crossed into El Paso. Their crossing was recorded by US immigration agents, who then produced a certificate of arrival like the one seen here. In the early 20th century, El Paso was a common location for employment agencies who paired laborers with employers. Many Mexican migrants found work on the railroads through these agencies, and it was typical that the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, or ATSF, employed the recent arrivals to El Paso. Trains and the labor they promised brought Mexican migrants to the Midwest. While some remained railroad workers, as evidenced by the ATSF prior service records, others, including those with families, found work in the sugar beet fields of western Kansas and Nebraska. Sometimes migrants paired this work and moved between urban and rural space, establishing the first of a variety of networks that sustained urban-rural connections. Before saying more about these connections, let's look again at the prominence and dispersion of Mexican communities in the lower Midwest. Migrants established communities across the region as early as 1910, and by 1920, the US Census counted Mexican people in many of the counties in Nebraska, Kansas, and Missouri, with 100 of Kansas's 105 counties recording at least one resident born in Mexico. While the census can be unreliable to a degree, it is more than clear that by 1920s, Mexicans had more than a foothold in the region. The map currently on your screen shows the communities that had a degree of documentation during the 1920s and 1930s. This included major Midwest cities like Omaha, Kansas City, and St. Louis, as well as smaller cities and large towns like Wichita and Topeka, Kansas. and then a number of small towns and farm communities, like those reliant on the sugar beet industry in and around Scottsbluff, Nebraska, as well as Kansas towns that included Garden City, Dodge City, Lyons, Coffeyville, and more. Even in this instance, the map hints at connections by allowing viewers to recognize proximity and ask questions about potential relationships between neighboring communities. For example, here is a cluster of communities in southeast Kansas that includes Fredonia, Coffeyville, Chanute, Independence, and Parsons. And here, following the rail lines from Kansas City and thinking of the Mexican presence in the region facilitated by railroad labor, it begins to come into focus how these communities could and did interact. I spoke of the common migration experience to the Midwest and the prevalence of communities throughout the region to discuss one of the first challenges I came across in mapping the Mexican Midwest, and one that speaks to the difficulties of mapping projects often face. How do we avoid treating these dynamic communities as static, and how do we map movement? One of my first hopes for the project was to incorporate migration routes. It seemed migration routes could show communities as permanent, but also reliant on the mobility of Mexican migrants. Scattered across the many archives I visited, it became clear how the regional community of the lower Midwest relied on urban-rural mobility. But at first, it was not clear how to represent that phenomenon. Immigration history often assumes the goal of migration to be leaving behind one's place of origin and settling in a new country. Usually paired with this assumption is a simplified migration narrative with only 2 points of interest. One, the country and maybe the state or province where the migrant was born, and two, the town or city where they live in their new country of residence. Of course, there is scholarship that complicates and challenges a simple 2-point migration narrative, but not enough to alter prevalent and popular narratives of immigration. I don't want to get too in the weeds here, and you'll have to wait for my book for a more nuanced explanation, but the point remains that it is common in our scholarship, classrooms, and popular histories that migration narratives are boiled down to a 2-point story. But mapping has the potential to confront this. In fact, the alternative is already there in a very common 20th century document, Petitions for Naturalization, also known as an application for citizenship. Naturalization records are rich resources that include a wealth of place and time data. Quickly looking at this record, we can see where and when this petitioner resides, where they were born, where they entered the United States, where they married, and where their children were born. It also includes data like their place of emigration, their last foreign residence, and times they may have returned to Mexico. Quickly, it becomes clear that this is a migration story of many points, and that the person applying for citizenship did not have a clear destination nor an initial desire for settlement that a 2-point immigration story usually tells. And based on the information contained, I thought visualizations of naturalization records could contribute to the story of Mexican-made urban-rural connections that were so important to this regional community in the lower Midwest. So I transferred the data from this petition and about 30 others to a spreadsheet and attempted to map migration routes using the program Cardo. While Cardo is a great program, and I'll be showing more of its features to the fellows tomorrow, I was unhappy with what the platform allowed me to do at the scale I hoped to represent multi-point migration. While I have since learned some features that would make this map more legible, Cardo's simplification of data visualization limited what I wanted to do with mapping migration routes. First and foremost, there's a lack of movement in this map. Mobility and migrant-made urban-rural connections are essential to understanding the Mexican community of the early 20th century in the lower Midwest. Yet that does not come through on this map. If you want to be generous, we can say that we see the many possible places a migrant passed through, and perhaps this communicates multi-point migration. Even if it does, it collapses many migrant experiences into one experience, while simultaneously making it difficult to recognize patterns because any recurring place in the data set overlaps itself, which makes it hard to see the repetition of a place on the map. One possible solution is a heat map. Now we see patterns better. Most of the migrants are coming from central Mexico. They're mostly crossing at El Paso, but also Eagle Pass and Laredo, Texas. Maybe they're passing through Kansas City before applying for citizenship in St. Joseph, Missouri. Still, I'm not sure how much a visitor to this map with limited context would be able to draw conclusions about Mexican migration to the Midwest in the early 20th century. This gets to some of the bigger challenges of mapping, figuring out how to make a map, one, that is legible to someone who is not you or familiar with your sources, and two, that can actually tell a story. This is all to say that mapping migration routes is hard. I'm still working on it, and it will eventually be a feature of this project. I'm happy to discuss this further in the Q&A, but for now, I'd like to dig deeper into how the current version of my project tells the story of mobility, community formation, and transnational connections. So again, let's return to our foundation, the Mexican communities on the map. Mexican consulate records are a rich resource for historical recovery and situate the lower Midwest regional community as not only essential to understanding the Midwest, but also to understanding Mexico. This screen capture on the right juxtaposes a census created by the Mexican consul in Kansas City during 1933 with a map representation of these communities mentioned. While this was a great start, it was still incomplete. It is a little difficult to see, but the census for Nebraska includes one category titled various farms. So clearly it wasn't giving me all of these communities. So I then went to city directories, WPA records, and newspapers to expand the visualization of these communities. For example, here you can see the many different neighborhoods that Mexicans inhabited in Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas City, Kansas, which was not adequately recorded in the consulate census. While this version of the map already refashions the image of the lower Midwest, it is in danger of communicating these spaces were empty vessels. Mexican neighborhoods were not simply containers where Mexicans slept when they did not work. Mexican migrants built long-lasting institutions like churches and repurposed other spaces like union halls, gymnasiums, streets, and parks for Mexican national holidays, dances, religious rituals, and baseball games. Religious activities and the establishment of churches were key actions of Mexican placemaking in the lower Midwest. Mexican migrants founded churches or recurring services in the basements, storefronts, and abandoned churches of cities and rural towns. They did this despite ambivalent leadership of the U.S. Catholic Church and in the face of racism from Anglo parishioners. Here, I've isolated the churches mapped in my project. There were multiple Our Lady of Guadalupe churches found in the region, such as those in Topeka, Kansas, Kansas City, Missouri, and Omaha and Scottsbluff, Nebraska. But this was only a portion of the vibrant religious life Mexican migrants crafted in the lower Midwest. Exploring the map shows how Mexicans practiced religions other than Catholicism, and that proximity often mattered to these communities. Even though proximity mattered, distance was not an obstacle. By adding community markers back into our visualization, we can see how it was necessary for some to travel to practice their faith. Here in western Nebraska, the town of Scottsbluff contained two institutions affiliated with the Catholic Church, a Mexican mission, and Our Lady of Guadalupe. The town also contained a Mexican Baptist church. While Our Lady of Guadalupe brought parishioners from nearby towns like Minatare and Bayard, the Mexican mission sent catechism teachers out to these nearby towns almost once a week. In religious practices like these, Mexicans fortified a regional community built on mobility. As I mentioned in the vignette at the start of this talk, travel and mobility were essential to the regional community. The visits by Consul Gagiola from Kansas City to rural Nebraska that I first discussed demonstrated another way that migrants produced urban-rural connections in the lower Midwest. I would like to zoom in on Mexican consulates and Comisiones Honoríficas Mexicanas to further emphasize migrant-made urban-rural connections and the transnational dimensions of the regional community, as well as how mapping these institutions through the visualization of consulate records helps us reconceptualize our social and political understandings of the region. Gagiola's visit to the Scottsbluff community and his assurances to the local Comisión Honorífica demonstrated that the Mexican Revolutionary Project did not halt at the US-Mexico border. Midwestern Mexican migrants had as much to say about what it meant to be Mexican as the Mexican state and its revolutionary programs in the first half of the 20th century. This was most pronounced in the proliferation of Comisiones Honoríficas Mexicanas and Fiestas Patrias in the region. where struggles to define the community dialectically gave birth to a transnational regional community. Here, mapping the Mexican Midwest shows the number of consular organizations, which included comisiones in the region. Mexicans use the celebration of national holidays, social organizations, the Mexican consulate, and reports of Mexico to better define the Midwestern Mexican community, which was founded in Mexican origins, but shaped by their locale. During the 1920s, Mexican consulate officials across the United States increasingly created and approved of official consular organizations. These organizations were usually the Comisiones Honorificas Mexicanas. Again, patriotic organizations requiring the sanctions of the Mexican consular service. A Comisión Honorifica served a range of purposes that included social services, cultural activities, and employment protection. Mexican consuls and migrants worked together to create patriotic societies that dotted the landscape of the lower Midwest and built an institutional web that connected dispersed Mexican communities to a central consulate, those in Kansas City and St. Louis, Missouri, and then to the Mexican state. As a result, Comisiones Honorificas simultaneously functioned as extensions of the Mexican state and as sites of negotiation for Mexican migrants to shape a national Mexican identity in the lower Midwest. The extensiveness of this web of consular organizations is well represented in mapping the Mexican Midwest. Here you can see a number of comisiones created in the 1920s and 1930s. Consulate records provided visibility of the communities themselves, insight into the leaders of each community, and evidence of how this regional community built urban-rural ties. When these records are visualized, we immediately see the long-term presence of Mexicans in the region and how consular organizations functioned as an essential space for urban-rural connections. But there are a range of possibilities to expand this project and deepen our understanding of how Mexicans reshaped the Midwest. One way to do so is through the consulate records that first presented a picture of how prominent the lower Midwest regional community was. Consulate records not only identify that these communities existed, they tell us how they were maintained and the dynamism of early Mexican communities in the lower Midwest. For example, if we imagine consulates and the comisiones as nodes, then we should be able to represent linkages that give meaning to the relationship between each node. Consulate correspondence logs are the records that can make this link visible. Here is just one sheet from all the correspondence in and out of the Kansas City Mexican consulate in 1932. The specific page here only contains 5 days of correspondence sent out by the consul, making this data-rich yet unwieldy for any analysis that does not use computational methods. The data contained gives us spatial and temporal information, as well as helpful descriptions of the issues at hand that relate to labor, immigration policy, incarceration, leisure, and different connections to Mexico. These correspondence logs show how Mexican ideas, grievances, and demands made the Mexican Midwest and negotiated the boundaries of the Mexican state far from the US-Mexico border. By putting this data into machine-readable tables, I will be able to visualize the links between communities and their consular organizations. Mapping these nodal links will not mean simply connecting dots, though that is an accomplishment in itself. Mapping these links as networks will allow us to see the frequency and quality of the connection between these nodes. What I mean by that is that we can see how often compatriots and consuls corresponded and the reason for their communication. By mapping the frequency and quality of correspondence, the interconnectivity of the regional community, their concerns, and its transnational characteristics can literally appear before your eyes. While you would hope that I would now wow you with some complicated yet readable layered map and network visualization, I haven't built it yet. But I still want to briefly show you how mapping the Mexican Midwest is suitable for this expansion and what work is necessary to make it a reality. Mapping the Mexican Midwest uses a JavaScript library called Leaflet. What you're seeing on the screen is the code on the left is the code that produces the map for the project and the map itself. I won't get into the technical too much, but basically Leaflet utilizes the programming language JavaScript and has some established rules and mechanisms to follow that allows you to construct a map. It allows you to layer information like data, markers, text, base maps, and more to build interactive visualizations. And here, interactive is crucial. One challenge of mapping is that the visualization can quickly become cluttered. The amount of information I am working with here could easily clutter the map. but by making it interactive, a user can select what they want to see and therefore view the story they are most interested in. This selection will be useful when determining the frequency and quality of links. Now, let's look at a machine-readable version of the page from the correspondence log I showed you earlier. Here is a screen capture of not even 3 days of correspondence sent from the Kansas City Consul to a range of places during 1932. Rural towns in Kansas and Nebraska appear, as does Mexico City, and the Mexican states of Michoacan and Nuevo León. And these letters, or telegrams, concern recuperating lost wages, financing repatriation, registering arrival in a new place, and seeking information about incarceration. My plan is to categorize the different issues with categories such as labor, fiestas patrias, and repatriation, to then allow users to toggle through the different types of linkages that structured the regional community. As I have mentioned, there are other important archives that make this project possible. And within those collections, other opportunities emerge to deepen our understanding of Mexican-made linkages that may not be clear in a common historical narrative. As consulate correspondence crisscrossed the Midwest and the US-Mexico border, migrants built other connections within their regional community. And while consular organizations reflected their hopes of remaining connected to Mexico, churches communicated Mexicans' desire to practice their faith where they lived. The Our Lady of Guadalupe Sodality of Topeka, a Catholic confraternity, reinforced a network of Mexican churches during the 1940s that traveling priests had built through the 1920s. On June 22, 1941, the Topeka Sodality held a conference for sodalities across the eastern third of Kansas, connecting Osawatomie, Ottawa, Manhattan, Lawrence, Emporia, Topeka, and Eudora. Sodality members saw the purpose of the conference as twofold: to understand the purpose of sodality and discuss, quote, the social problems that confront our Mexican youth, end quote. The pastor of St. Catherine's Church of Emporia wanted Mexican youth to organize to, quote, exert more power and prestige in demanding more rights and privileges in society than those which we have been enjoying, end quote. Kansas ethnic Mexicans saw their church group and community as one as they had hoped to reinforce spiritual bonds and demand a better material life from local officials. The map of the organizations making up this conference presents a Mexican religious network that allows users to reimagine Eastern Kansas on the eve of World War II. Paired with the churches displayed earlier, Eastern Kansas contained physical and organizational religious institutions that remade Midwestern space into Mexican religious space. In fact, the attendees communicated just that in their conversations during the conference and their visions for after. The Topeka Sodality continued to ruminate on the conference and what their efforts portended. The editors of El Progreso, a Sodality newsletter that circulated in Eastern Kansas, reflected 2 months after the conference that it had two aims. Quote, one, it was to bring our Mexican sodalists in touch with one another, to make them feel that they belong to a body, realize that in each town there is a handful of ambitious boys and girls who are willing to work for the spiritual, social, and material good of our fellow countrymen. Two, the other purpose of the convention was to give an idea of how we prepare another for the next year, end quote. The Sodalities from Manhattan and Ottawa, Kansas also wrote to the Topeka Sodalists, reflecting on the conference and their work at home. These connections continued the following month after the Topeka organization received a new director, Reverend Ignacio Jimenez. Father Jimenez soon visited the Lawrence Sodality and encouraged his Topekan flock to support the fledgling Lawrence group. This brief narrative represented community formation in action and an additional representation of the links that connect churches and communities that can be layered over the initial project. Traveling priests and religious organizations like the Sodalities of Eastern Kansas offer networks that, when mapped, reveal the interconnectedness of the regional community. The first instance of mapping the Mexican Midwest provides a partial snapshot of Mexican migrant communities during the interwar years. Visitors can recognize the diversity of Mexican residents in the lower Midwest, whether occupying multiple neighborhoods in a larger metropolitan area, relegation to the other sides of the tracks in smaller cities, or inhabiting rural towns. By representing Mexican institutions, mapping the Mexican Midwest illustrates that these were not temporary outposts. Mexican migrants established churches and organizations to create a sense of belonging on their terms. While some may frame the region as a white and rural heartland, the visualizations of this site defiantly say otherwise. Mapping the Mexican Midwest illustrates how Mexican migrants were part of the economic and social fabric of the region. And now, one can recognize what early 20th century Mexicans saw, a region filled with their compatriots, churches, and comisiones. Thank you very much for taking the time to hear a little more about my project and the power I see in digital mapping. I'm happy to field any questions you might have about today's talk and my related work as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryan. That was spot on for a colloquium in digital storytelling. Really appreciate it. As I encourage all of you to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to throw some questions in as they see fit. As I wait for those questions to populate, Bryan, I'm going to get us started here with this one. And I want to take you back to slide 14. You don't necessarily have to put it up again. You can if you want, but slide 14 was like it was a map of Kansas that had a number of the Mexican-American communities plotted on the map. And as I was looking at it, one of the things that struck me was that the communities were all where I expected them to be, right? They were in Kansas City, Lawrence, Manhattan, Emporia. Perfect, there we go, right? And so my question is, like, so the Mexican American communities, they're all in the centers of population. How far do we have to zoom in on these things? Because I'm guessing there's more remarkable stories lurking here, but they're perhaps at a different level of resolution.
Yeah, so when you're zooming in with all the aspects on the map, like some of those first like opening stills and finishing stills, you can start to ask more questions about these population centers. So like with the consular organizations, you'll see maybe only one or two in a place where, or a region where maybe there's like 5 or 6 communities. And so I don't have the consulate organization there, but they're out of Fredonia, Chanute, Parsons, Independence, and Coffeyville. I think about 2 of them have comisiones. So then once you start zooming into some of these rural towns, you're like, okay, are people using that comisión, that patriotic organization, to communicate with the consulate, with the Mexican state? Are they sending their own communications? Are they traveling to these other towns to have celebrations and things like that? Something I didn't talk about as much today is that, especially in these rural parts of Kansas and in Nebraska, there's usually a central place for Fiestas Patrias, or specifically the celebration of Mexican Independence Day in the 20s and 30s. And so Wellington is a major hub for these celebrations, Wellington, Kansas. So people are coming from Eastern Kansas, even sometimes coming from Kansas City, despite Kansas City having its own celebration of Mexican Independence Day, to travel to this well-known celebration in places like Wellington. So there certainly are deeper stories to tell and more involved stories to tell about some of these rural places, in addition to some of the well-known communities even today, like Topeka or Wichita or Kansas City.
That's spot on. Thank you. A number of questions are populating both the Q&A and the chat. Just let me mention that a number of them say great job. So I just want to underscore that before we start asking the questions here. Here's a great one from Claire Perot. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing this. Claire says this: I'm wondering if you can talk more specifically about how this mapping project has influenced your thinking. Did you have any aha moments, or did your thinking change in some way once you saw it on the map?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a little bit of both. There was some aspects where I was seeing these urban-rural connections in the archive, and I wanted to make that easier to see. Often you'll have folks just study an agricultural region or community, or just an urban setting, and I was seeing these stories of Mexican migrants connecting urban-rural spaces. I will say where I started to have ahas is what I want to add to the project that isn't fully there, that I've been playing around on my own but isn't polished enough to share yet, is seeing differences in where people are crossing the border. So usually the story in the 10s and 20s is especially for the Midwest, everyone's being contracted out of El Paso, and and that's how they are finding railroad jobs and other types of employment in the Midwest. And when I started playing around with those heat maps and just putting this data on a screen, I saw darker bubbles in Laredo and Eagle Pass, and that's just not in the narratives of Mexican migration at this time. Yes, those are common border passings, but generally, but it's not the narrative we see when we talk about Mexican migration to the Midwest. El Paso is front and center for these stories. And so that was a moment where I saw basically the heat map, they were similar density in those three places. And so now I'm starting to ask more questions. Well, okay, is there another story to tell? And will mapping help me figure that out? Do folks passing through Laredo end up being in a certain place in the Midwest? Or maybe through Eagle Pass? What's the relationship between where they go through to where they came from, and where, if not where they end up, but other places they work or live during my period of study?
One of the things I really appreciate about your talk is the way you made the data visible to us. And so we, like you said in the intro, we got to see under the hood a little bit. A couple of questions have come up about that data. So I'm going to sort of ask you two data-related questions that keep coming in, maybe three data-related questions in a row here. Here's the first one. Would the Kansas City National Archives have copies of petitions of naturalization or certificates of arrival for migrants who ended up in Dodge City? And I think this part is a key point here. Is this kind of data easy to access for someone without a lot of historical research experience?
All right. Thanks for those questions. So I'm trying to think of Dodge City. I think Dodge City records would be in the Kansas City National Archive. So the data you're seeing that I'm showing you is through the St. Joseph District Court, which is held in the Kansas City National Archives. And they have other district courts from Nebraska and Kansas. I'm not sure which district court Dodge City falls under, but the narrow finding aids online should be able to help you figure that out. And you could always email them and see if they could tell you which district court Dodge City fell under, and then it would be easy enough, I think, to find these. Sometimes there's some paywalls if you're trying to do this digitally. So if you have access to Ancestry, you can access these records for sure. If you're looking for a certain person, that makes it a little easier. But even if you're not, you can access these petitions with more general search terms for places and time periods and things like that. So I access them. Those pictures you see are from me being in the archive. And so you can call on them as long as you know which court you want to look through and kind of what you're looking for, whether it's someone's place of origin, or maybe you actually have a name you're looking for, things like that. So it is possible to access them depending on your ability to get through the paywall or to travel to Kansas City.
So here's a couple more data questions. And as they continue to roll in, I'm getting the sense that people are quite charmed and curious about your facility with data. So I'm really glad you made the choice to put some of that on the screen. A set of related questions from my colleague Terry Koenig and also from Danielle Orange about how do you keep the data from cluttering your map? What ways do you suggest or not for including links to texts and or photos on a map? And how do you choose which data to include?
Yeah, so I realized that there's one thing I didn't show in my images that would help make a little sense out of this. Let me just share this real quick, sorry. All right, so right here, when I'm talking about layering, I actually mean having choices to layer what data you see on the screen. And so this is a big reason why I went with Leaflet and JavaScript. So there's the potential for this to be very cluttered. And so there's a couple ways I go about that. So one is that I want the communities to all be shown. And so you can click on these and see what the community is, what type of community it is. So the fact that they're pop-ups that can come and go, that helps minimize how much information is on the screen, but you can still find out what's there. And then I chose different markers for churches and consular organizations. So again, here you can see, you can choose what you want to see on the screen. So let's say I still want to see what communities are there, but I also want to see what churches there are. I can click on churches. Now they populate the screen. And then, you know, I'm really interested in Western Nebraska. So this 3 here means that there's 3 church organizations in that vector, and Leaflet kind of determines the size of those vectors. But anyway, by clustering the churches or then the consular organizations, it also minimizes what you see on the screen right away and gives you the option to dig deeper. So if I click on Western Nebraska, this is going to take us in really far because they're close together. So I click that, and it takes me into Scottsbluff, and then I see the 3 institutions: the Mexican Mission, where it was around the 1930s, the Mexican Baptist Church, and then Our Lady of Guadalupe. And then I zoom back out, and it starts to pull them back together as I zoom out. And then you have to zoom out a little further to see where other churches are that you may want to explore. So clicking in here, you see most of this is in Kansas City. And I know it's jumping around a little bit, but that's just how to quickly move through the map, but also minimize how much information is there. And then there was a second question that, could you repeat that, Dave? I think I missed that.
For sure. Talking about how do you choose which data to include? Oh, and would you suggest or not, or what do you suggest or not for including links to text and or photos on a map?
Okay, so for choosing, I first wanted to keep it simple and just make sure that there was something there that communicated that these communities were there, that there was institution building going on, and that just seeing where these communities are, what institutions they built, gives us a new perception of these communities, of what made these communities, and also how these communities made the Midwest. And so I chose what kept it simple, but as I talked about later on, I want to add to this, now that I'm a little more familiar with Leaflet, this JavaScript library that I've been talking about, I can see how I can add more layers to it using that toggle screen, so that there can be more information on there, but it's still not overloading the user. So it really depends on your data, what you choose and what you want to go with. I think institutions are a good way to alter how we conceptualize space, and seeing what institutions were built, I think is an effective way to do that. As far as adding photos and other kinds of text and things like that, I think that's absolutely feasible. I don't have the chops for that with my map, but so at least with using Leaflet and JavaScript, if you know JavaScript, that potential's in there and like popping up those images. So it is possible for, say, I eventually map those migration routes on a naturalization certificate, any point where that person crosses through, I could pop out their naturalization certificate or their certificate of arrival or something like that. So the possibilities are there. I haven't chosen to do that yet, but I think it would be a really compelling project to do that.
Yeah, that would be really cool to be able to
Yeah,
see the archival documents right in space there on the map.
yeah.
Just want to draw everyone's attention to the fact that big thanks to Kaylin at the IDRH, we have a link to Bryans Map right there in the chat. So if you want to navigate this map by yourself, or if you want to make selections and choose what layers you're looking at, just go ahead and click on that link in the chat and you can play around on the map on your own. We're going to come back to the question of various platforms. We're going to come back to the various layers you used, but I want to stick with a data question for one more second here. This one's from Meg Smith. She says, I'd love to hear a little more about how you deal with data transparency. Manipulating this data includes so many decisions, as you've described. How do you encapsulate those for your viewers?
Thanks for that question, Meg. So on the different pages of the site, I explain what these institutions are and what these organizations are. So that's part of just giving more context to it, I think is important. The data on the back end is accessible. I don't think I actually linked to my repo, but it is public. So I do have that information out there. But I will say that there is a degree of making decisions, and any representation, especially for institutions that may not exist anymore, comes with its challenges and incompleteness. And so, for example, the churches in Kansas City, Our Lady of Guadalupe goes through 3 or 4 different iterations until it's in its current home now that is still there. And so I'm only representing one of those incarnations, the current location that was built around 1926. But there are like storefront Our Lady of Guadalupe's prior to that in the digital record. So I guess I am obscuring that a little bit. And that's part of that is because I'm more showing a general view of what these communities look like in the 20s and 30s, rather than just this is what it looked like in 1924, this is what it looked like in 1925, and so on and so forth, because I think that is really challenging to communicate on a map. And what I'm very interested in with my project is challenging how we're seeing this space, or how we're conceiving of this space. And so those smaller changes over time, I think, at least for my work, are more useful in a book format or article format.
Let's go back to the question of the 3 layers. Juan Mora asks, can you talk a little bit more about why you chose the layers of communities, churches, and consuls? And are there different markers that you were or are considering?
Yeah. So I chose these 3 layers is one for the communities to see, for folks to see where these communities are and think about if they pass through these spaces, if they've thought about them before as Mexican communities or now Latinx communities. And so one is just that questioning of how have I thought about this space before? And I think just placing the communities there is important. And I chose circles instead of those points to kind of show that it's more than just a point on a map, it's a neighborhood or area. One thing I would like to do with these markers, which will take a little more skill with GIS, so Geographic Information Systems, is actually drawing the boundaries of these communities. And so like if you zoom into the Kansas City area, there's the West Side neighborhood, there's the Armourdale neighborhood, and right now there are these little circles that are based in where that community was, but doesn't fully encapsulate it. So in the future, I would like more defined markers. And then as far as the churches and consular organizations, I chose them because those were some of the more dynamic aspects of these communities, and that showed how Mexicans changed the physical landscape in buying or building churches, and then also contested the the political landscape in using consular organizations to declare their patriotism as Mexican nationals, to negotiate their belonging through their Mexican citizenship, and then also challenge the Mexican state and the official idea of what it meant to be Mexican at the time. And so my hope is to differentiate those markers, whether that's like with a little church symbol for religious organizations, or just a different kind of marker to be a little more legible to the viewer.
I loved actually the churches and the communities, because it seems like it can be hard to tell a story of communal life based on the kind of data you're using. Like you have some really bureaucratic data,
Yeah.
but by telling church stories, it almost kind of brought that data alive for me in surprising ways, in ways that felt not very bureaucratic. So I appreciated that. All right, there are two more really good questions here.
Okay.
In the last few minutes. Two different people, both, and forgive me on the pronunciations, Jennifer Hinojosa and Ron Y, have talked about platforms. I'm going to read Ron's question. Could you talk about the programs that you've used for this project? Are you familiar with, and would you recommend using ArcGIS Story Map?
Yeah, so in like starting to figure out this project, I've used Carto. I've tried to play around with QGIS, but it was a steeper learning curve than I wanted, and in the like time frame I wanted to launch this project. And I was also playing around with like Google Earth at first, just to like, okay, like when I first started trying to map, how do I put a point on a map? And so just like starting with that basic level was something I hadn't thought of before, and I had to start doing. So I did start with different software that just like made me think about what it meant to mark something on a map. And then with Carto, it was like, okay, how do I put my data into rows and columns so that some other program can read it? And then by the time I got to Leaflet, it was like, okay, how can I manipulate the map and the settings of the map so it shows what I want to show? And so that was kind of, at least the visualization tools, that was my process of learning and thought there. As far as other tools I use, I started building these tables in Excel, and I am done with Excel because of how it changes dates automatically on you, and how it changes character settings. So I started using either Google Sheets or a text editor, so that the program didn't change my data without me changing it, because that was annoying and frustrating. So I, not to shit all over Excel, but I would suggest you don't use it if you want to build things with rows and columns. And so, yeah, that's another important tool. I am familiar with ArcGIS Story Maps, but I don't use it, but I think it's a great tool and people build great projects with it. And if you have some familiarity with it, I would keep building your project with it, because people have made some awesome stuff with it.
Okay, we'll close out with this one. This was actually one of the very first questions that came in. It's one of my favorites. It's a big one. It's from Austin Wetzel. Did you find many cases of individuals or communities Americanizing or losing their Mexican identity in the process?
That is a big question and a good one. So, because most of my work is pre-World War II, I can say strongly enough that while there were Americanization programs and ways that Mexican communities incorporated American cultures or celebrations into their lives, these communities in the central US were still very much rooted in their Mexicanness and their relationship to Mexico. But in that process of living in the Midwest, they fashioned their own sense of Mexicanness in the region. And so that was through these institutions that I talk about, and others as well, but through churches performing, like naming their churches after Our Lady of Guadalupe, performing Las Posadas, which is a religious ceremony around Christmas, where they're reenacting the story of Jesus and Mary, but doing that as a migrant takes on a different meaning, especially doing it far from Mexico, where you are trying to claim belonging. So there are all these attributes of Mexican life, celebrations of Mexican Independence Day that remain strong in the region. So I don't think, I wouldn't argue that they're losing their Mexican identity. I think they're recrafting it in the context of being in a place far from Mexico, but where they can still remain connected to Mexico.
Thank you, Bryan. Before you all log off, please take a moment to put a note of appreciation in the chat bar. As an occasional Zoom presenter, I know one of the hardest things is the abruptness with which these things end. So let's do our best to convey our gratitude to Bryan through the chat bar. Hope to see all of you on March 24th for our next colloquium. For the DH fellows out there, we'll see you tomorrow for our private workshop with Bryan. Bryan, thank you. So much appreciated. It's wonderful, and look forward to being in touch. Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much.